If you like expansive history, but you also like it to be very outdated, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I am covering Our Oriental Heritage by Will Durant. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today I'm taking a look at Our Oriental Heritage, the first volume in the massive 11-volume series, The Story of Civilization by Will and Ariel Durant. This is the first book, and so it's actually only written by Will Durant. At least Ariel doesn't get any credit. I have to assume that she did play a role in proofreading and editing of it, but I have no way of knowing that for sure. This book came out in 1935, which means it is 90 years old, which means it came out before the Second World War, which means it is clearly outdated. However, to its credit, it doesn't try to cover anything too contemporary, so some of its outdatedness is mitigated by the fact that it's also just didn't cover anything too hot and too current. This book is distinct from the rest in the series for two big reasons. First of all, its scope. Obviously, the older you go in any series like this, the more time period every book is going to cover. So the later books obviously cover shorter and shorter amount of time. That's common. Pick up any world history textbook and it'll do the same thing. Your original chapters are going to cover hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, and as you get closer to the present, you're going to find yourself covering decades and sometimes only years at a time. This is going to be one of the biggest books in the series in terms of scope, but it is also one of the biggest books in terms of size. I believe it's second only to The Age of Faith, which is the fourth book in the series. The other reason why this book is distinct is it's the only one that does not exclusively talk about Europe. It actually talks about a bunch of different countries, and some of those countries and areas of the world he brings much closer to the present, granted the present being 1935, than any of the other books do. It's meant to try and set the stage for the rest of this series, except it's distinct because it actually covers way more than what the rest of the series covers. As I've already said before in my introduction to the series, all the other books are basically Western Civ. The second book in the series is Greece, the third book is Rome, and so on and so forth up to the Age of Napoleon. So you can see how it's not exactly going to be too expansive, despite the fact that it says it's the story of civilization. This book is the exception. Our Oriental Heritage is the one that actually tries to talk about India, Japan, China, and it has a few very interesting things to say. Just reading from my book, the first section is, of course, about how civilizations are created, the things that are necessary. The second section is on the Near East, which, just a point of context for those of you who don't know, the difference between the Near East and the Middle East is geographically essentially the same, but more or less when you talk about the Near East, you are talking about before the rise of Islam, and the Middle East is a reference to after the rise of Islam. That's the quick and dirty. You can definitely find people that disagree on that, but that more or less is what I learned when I got my master's, and so that's what I stick by. So when people say Near East, they're talking about what is modern day Levant, Iraq, Iran, pretty much everything that you would now consider part of the Middle East. The second section is on India and her neighbors, which of course means the rest of the Indian subcontinent. Again, this was written in 1935, so this is going to predate the independence of India, which means that the countries of Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka didn't even exist yet. Book 3 is all about the Far East, which is of course going to include modern day China, Japan, the Koreas, which, by the way, prior to this book, Korea would have been essentially a colony of Japan at this time period, which is, by the way, probably one of the most interesting things about this book is when he covers Japan, that is the part of the book where he is discussing stuff that is contemporary to his time, and he even has a note in there of concern over the aggression of Japan. You don't see it so much in Germany because, well, he doesn't cover Germany, but he is very clearly concerned with the rise of Japan, and you can see some sentiments, maybe some anti-Asian sentiments, but as a whole, concern over the imperialism of Japan, and he even makes a reference to concern that if Japan does not temper its desires, that this could lead to conflict between the US and Japan, and there is, of course, a footnote that likes to point out that he wrote that prior to World War II, so that's one of the more interesting little tidbits that he wrote about, and something that we can see has resonance to a certain degree. There is a lot to this book. Just look at that. That thing's huge. I think that it is a great read for anyone that's interested in not just an outdated history, but an attempt at a generalized history. So obviously everything that it covers, it's written in a way that's meant to be appealing to a broader audience, something that you can't always find from most specialized textbooks. But on top of that, it's trying to give a characterization of a lot of different places that might be oversimplified. And not just because he's trying to cover too much, but because this was a time and place where giving generalizations might be a little more acceptable than we might consider nowadays. I would try to refrain from generalizing people and places. I think the best example of that I cited in my introduction is when he describes the kingdom of the Hebrews, and later when he discusses Jewish people, he uses language that I'm not going to call it anti-Semitic, but it definitely feels a little uncomfortable that he is so ready to give generalized characterizations of people. And that's kind of found throughout this whole book. That being said, it may not be a book for you if that's going to trouble you, and I fully understand if it does, but you also have to understand that it is something that's a product of its time. Not that that makes it okay, but it is something that you have to remember when you read a book this old. On top of that, it's not exactly teeming with any of the major debates that you might have about any of these places, and because it stops in 1935, it gives it this really weird feel. A feel of trying to give a complete history of certain countries and territories on the one hand, but on the other hand, stopping in 1935 means you're missing a whole lot of really important history for a lot of places in the world. When he talks about Asia, he of course is completely missing all of World War II and a post-World War II Japan. When he talks about China, this is going to be taking place around the Chinese Revolution and leading into World War II. He does not have any idea of what exactly is going to take place in the post-World War II China. And so these types of things make it a little harder to fully appreciate exactly what he's trying to accomplish in this first book. There is no greater evidence of the fact that it's a little dated than the name of the book, Our Oriental Heritage. That is not a title that you would see people putting on books nowadays for obvious reasons. I think that's a pretty good harbinger of the flaws of this book. It's clearly dated in its attitude, it's got problems with the scope, and there's just a lot that is worth pointing out in terms of its weaknesses. But it does have a fair amount of strengths in the fact that it's pretty easy to read. Most ancient history, so when he talks about the Near East and Egypt, I think his details and his characterizations are pretty straightforward and pretty easy to understand because that was his intention. However, when he wrote this book, his understanding of the scope of the whole series seems to have been different. When he wrote this book, I don't get the impression that he realized this would be the only book that would touch upon parts of the world outside of modern day Europe. Even though many of the countries he covers does go up to the present, I thought for sure he planned on incorporating more, especially philosophy, since that was Will Durant's specialty, was this history of philosophy. It appears he expected to incorporate more of that as he progressed in each of his subsequent books. And like I said, he even intended from the beginning for the series to only be, I think, 4 books. But that changed with each subsequent book. And so I think that that affects the importance of this book in the rest of the series. I actually think most people, if you wanted to read this series but did not for one reason or another want to read this first book, you probably could skip it because it's so different from the rest of the books in many different ways. But I also think since it's the only book in this series that touches upon anywhere outside of Europe to any real degree, it makes it one of the most important books for the whole series. Like I said in my introduction series, I think that this whole series is for people that are interested in long and slightly dated histories of Europe. And I don't think this series is going to be for the faint of heart. I do think this is one of the books that you could pick up on its own and read it by itself and decide whether you want to read the rest of the series or not. Just be aware that it is not very representative of the rest of the series. For that reason, this book is a two-edged sword. On the one hand, you can read it on its own. Technically, you could read any of the books on their own. It's not like it's a real big novel series in which he's building one upon another. He's obviously going sequentially, historically speaking, but at any given book, you can pull it off and read it as is. That also means this one is distinct from the rest simply because it just doesn't have the same type of structure and it doesn't have the same kind of narrative that we're going to find in all of the other books. Some people, it's going to be the best one in the series for them to read, and for some people, it's actually going to be the worst one in the series for them to read. So it's up to you whether you want to read this book in and of itself, but I stand by the fact that if you want to read this series as a whole, you're really going to have to just do it slowly but surely, because quite frankly, it is quite a big series, and as interesting as this series is, it is a massive undertaking to actually read all these books. But I would like to know what you guys have to think about specifically Our Oriental Heritage, or if you want to go and give me a review as the series of a whole, please go to my introduction video and put the comment there. Either way, I'll be very interested in seeing what you guys have to say. Don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that notification button, and until next time, keep those pages turning.